version can be an edited version can be put onto our website alongside the briefing. It will only feature the speakers and those that ask questions. But if you prefer to remain anonymous, then please turn off your cameras and edit your Zoom name. So, as I said earlier, this was, I think, our most popular series so far. We're really excited to hear from Sarah and Alex. They are the most important people here today, so I'm not going to take up too much more time. Just in terms of what happens next, I will shortly hand over to Sarah and Alex. They will talk about their review. I have a couple questions to ask of them. And then in the second half of the session, the expert Russell will take over and will be managing the Q&A for participants. So without further ado, Sarah and Alex, I would like to hand over to you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Sam. Should we just introduce ourselves briefly?
Yes.
So I'm Dr. Sarah Waite. I'm a senior lecturer in criminology at Leeds Beckett University.
And I'm Dr. Alex Bradley, and I'm a senior lecturer at Leeds Beckett University as well.
Thanks for inviting us to talk about the evidence review. Alex and I are really excited about it. We're going to talk over the subheadings. We have no slides, so we're going to keep it quite informal and chat about the evidence review. We'll talk about the headings in there, looking at why problem-solving courts for women are important, some of the underpinning features of them, particularly gender responsivity. We'll talk a little bit about the current evidence base, particularly the evidence base that we have in the UK. And then we're going to talk about the findings from the research that Alex and I did, which was focused particularly on the Manchester model. So in terms of problem-solving courts for women, they are, as I'm sure that you're all aware, I've just sort of seen names and like charities popping up, so I'm sure everybody's aware. They're receiving great attention at the moment after the successful pilot of the Birmingham ISC model for women. And problem-solving courts more broadly come from a model that started in the US. So there's a lot of international evidence that suggests that these models are successful for different areas of offending. So they started out as drug courts in the US, and the idea is that the judge or magistrate, whoever is at the centre of the court, oversees somebody's order. So somebody will be sentenced to a problem-solving court order, and then they will come back to the court for review. The idea behind them is firstly to divert people from custody, and secondly to address needs associated with reoffending. And they're the two tracks in the UK that have emboldened the most recent development of problem-solving court models for women. And I just mentioned those two tracks because it's really important to pay attention to the evidence base in terms of how effective they are at addressing reoffending, but also the evidence base in terms of how effective they are at diverting women from custody. In terms of problem-solving courts for women, there are 4 models across the UK. So there's the Birmingham ISC model, there's the Manchester model, there was a court based on this problem-solving court model in Liverpool, and then there's one in Scotland as well. And Shona Minson and Ruth Armstrong have produced a really excellent overview of how those models work. In terms of the evidence base, so we know internationally that problem-solving courts models can be successful when they hold state accountability at the heart of how they operate. So there is a particularly successful model in Argentina that has a reoffending rate of 0% across 7 years, which I think whenever we talk about that statistic to anybody in the UK is just like amazing. So when they run effectively and really address where people have been let down by the state, they are very successful in what they aim to do. In terms of looking at them specifically for women, then the idea is that gender responsivity, addressing the needs associated with women committing crime and being criminalised by the state, is at the heart of what these models do. So the Manchester model, for example, is made up of the judiciary, which is magistrates in this case, probation, the courts, and then the women's centre. And in terms of the evidence base for how effective they are in the UK, because they are so new, there's very little out there. There's been an interim evaluation done on the Birmingham ISC model, but that is part of an evaluation of 4 courts. So only one of those are for women. So if you read through the interim report, there's not as much information that we'd like there in terms of understanding how these work specifically with women, what sort of guidance is put in place for staff operating with women within these spaces, and how women are experiencing it. So when Alex and I went to look at the Greater Manchester model, that is what we were interested in mostly. We were interested in how women were experiencing this court process, and what type of things women were saying about the court processes. So I think that's what we're going to sort of move to focus on.
So in terms of our evidence base, we kind of separated the findings into sort of 3 distinct areas, which I'm going to talk to you about today. So the first being trauma sensitive and comfortable environments, ownership, visibility and participation, and also clear and meaningful communication. And I think probably the biggest sort of recommendation and findings were associated with the spaces where these reviews are taking place. So fundamentally, court spaces and family justice spaces are not trauma informed by design. They are places where post-sentence reviews take place, and the findings from our research would suggest that a more suitable place would be in a neutral community setting where women feel safer. And this was really recognised and shared by magistrates who we interviewed, probation staff who we interviewed, and women as well. So it was very much a shared discussion point about recognizing that these spaces are spaces associated with fear and also negative experiences for women. And ultimately, women haven't had positive experiences in those spaces. And there are concerns with those spaces being places for those relational discussions to take place. And ultimately, that environment hugely impacts the experiences of women accessing those reviews. It does impact on women's feelings of safety and also engagement within that support. The more comfortable that women feel within those spaces or within those reviews, the more meaningful conversations and support that can take place. There's a concern relating to fear within that environment and a potential performance that may take place within that space. And that doesn't necessarily mean that women are getting what they want and what they need from those interactions. I think we really need to be quite cautious when we talk about trauma-informed discourse. There are a lot of trauma-inducing institutional practices, disempowering spaces widely across the justice system. And I think it is okay to talk about really good practice, really caring practice and celebrating that practice, but it doesn't always necessarily have to be specifically trauma-informed, which much more focuses on a relational support model whereby safety is prioritized and enhanced, advocating for equitable power dynamics and also the empowerment of women. And it's quite often associated with healing as well. So I think that we need to sometimes tread quite carefully with that narrative. In terms of ownership, visibility, and participation, women really wanted to be involved within the design Women wanted to see themselves and be visible within the participation of the reviews at each stage as well. And women talked about really wanting to use this experience to support other women who come into contact with problem solving courts, to kind of provide that, peer-led support, that empowering support, hope, and that mentorship as well. And this could be really beneficial to support access to much wider resources and services to enhance that engagement and that belief within the review process as well. And ultimately, as the review highlighted, the evidence review, that lived experience informed relationships can actually increase women's sense of safety, connection, and emotional well-being as well. And really that would help to ground the problem solving court models within women's social realities as well, but also being quite cautious to ensure that ethical processes and non-tokenistic participatory models are used within those spaces as well. And then the final finding and kind of key point that we wanted to talk about is clear and meaningful communication. So that can be a variety of different things. So women really wanted to have access to information that was clear, that was well timed, and also person-centered in terms of language. And when language did reinforce shame or stigma or stereotypes, this ultimately undermined the trust and the engagement within that process and within that review. And especially because we're thinking about gender responsive and relational work as well, I think, we really need to be quite cautious and mindful of the language that is used widely. Women did talk about feeling that the praise within the reviews was superficial. Often conversations felt somewhat repetitive to that what they'd already had with probation officers, and this ultimately impacted upon women's sense of trust within the process and the purpose for them. And I think we always kind of go back to what is meaningful for women and what do women need these reviews to help with, what do we need these reviews to look like? And women were really, understandably sensitive around discussions where it was past focused or offence focused. With this being a post sentence review, women found it far more beneficial to focus on, celebratory opportunities that were a lot more validating and sort of supportive in nature. So those are like our key findings and sort of observations from this research.
One of the final things that we just wanted to finish on as well was when we talked to women about women couldn't sort of tell us enough about all the positives that they'd got from the support on the problem solving court order, which they referred it to us. So when we unpicked that, it was coming from the women's centres. It was the work and the support and absolutely the signposting, the relationships, everything that was being done in the women's centres. So there was something about that long-term support and that financial support for the women's centres who were doing the problem solving that we just sort of wanted to drive home as well. But that's it from us. I think we've done about 10 minutes.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, guys. That was incredibly clear. And I now have a couple of questions for both of you, which potentially cover some of what you've already covered. So you can kind of pick and choose what you want to answer. I was wondering, in terms of your opinion and based on all of your research, what would you say are the non-negotiables in terms of the key elements needed in the running of a women's problem-solving court?
So I think in terms of the practical running, the non-negotiables from the women's perspective that we spoke to would be safe environments post reviews. So taking them out of legal spaces where women have had really negative experiences and associations. And that's not just with being, sentenced and convicted before. It's things like care experience and things like having their children removed through those proceedings and those institutions. So I think, somewhere safe like the women's centres, and that's what the women said to us consistently, if it wasn't held in a sort of institutional space like a courtroom, and it wasn't always just about the courtroom. So women talked to us about turning up outside to the building and how that felt, and how they felt just because that was somewhere that people went for punishment or legal processes, that felt shameful and stigmatizing. They were worried about who would see them going in again for punishment when they'd already been sentenced and things like that. So I think definitely safe spaces, and also the sustainable funding of women's centres, who are the ones that are doing the problem solving. That needs to be sort of key.
Yeah. And there's a real emphasis on strong multi-agency relationships and working, and kind of utilizing those connections to enhance the resources that are on offer to women, and also fast-tracked support as well.
It's as if you've seen the questions I'm about to ask you, Alex, because you are taking us to the next question, which was, you talk about that multi-agency work. How, you may not be able to answer this, but how do you think that collaboration can be strengthened between the stakeholders needed to make a success of the problem-solving course?
I was really lucky that when I was doing my PhD, like nearly 10 years ago, I actually saw some really good practice, and I've continued to see this across the justice system. And I think what kind of solidifies that good practice is like this commitment and this shared set of values to model trauma-informed practice within the interactions between organizations and agencies, and that in turn connects to transparency and information sharing and the importance of those strong relationships. And I think some of the really good examples that exist within the criminal justice system widely are in spaces where co-location takes place, where there are value-based commitments, things like trauma-informed language and flexibility within approaches that are agreed, as this kind of share valued base. But also, the criminal justice system funding isn't set up to necessarily promote this. So I think it's amazing that, the Women's Justice Collective and various women's centres have pushed back against that, but against that competitive funding landscape, and have worked collaboratively and compassionately together to fight for the things that they are working towards. So there is something about fairer and equitable funding that really represents the requirements from each particular service and organisation to enhance that transparency as well.
Thank you, Alex. Sarah, is anyone wanted to add on that, or should I move on to the
No, I think Alex has answered that perfectly.
Thank you, Alex. So I'm only going to ask one more question, because I'm conscious that there will be a lot of interest in asking questions. So I'll hand over to Russell shortly. So my last question for the two of you, let's pretend that you were in charge of the government's response to the sentencing review. One of the commitments is expanded provision of problem-solving courts or intensive supervision courts. How would you ensure that? Is it just about funding? What else is needed to ensure that it's embedded as widely as possible?
I think funding would be a big part of it, especially for the women's services. But I think embedding the gender responsivity is so important, and thinking about how we do that, because it's not just about sending staff, for example, on training around trauma. It's about listening to women and their experiences and embedding that in the model and the design and the delivery and the training of staff, just embedding it in everything. And I think that's, again, not just about understanding the context of women's lives, it's about understanding how these processes feel to women. Because if we're thinking about trauma, powerlessness and helplessness is at the centre of it, isn't it? And criminal justice processes, because of how they run, are about power dynamics. So there's all sorts of aspects that need to be thought of, language that we use. I could list loads of things. So I think embedding that gender responsivity, but the depth of it is really important. Alex, I don't know if you've got anything to add.
I think the only thing that I would add is just I think we've all been really inspired by Jimena from Argentina, the judge. And I think there is something really powerful in the way that she talks about justice and the judiciary and that state responsibility within that space. Because we often talk about the responsibilization and disempowerment of women and shame and, women within these spaces. And actually the way that this, this international judge talks about it is actually, I am a representative of the state, and the person sitting in front of me has been failed at multiple levels by the state, and I'm here to restore that sense of trust. So she really takes on that embodiment of responsibility and accountability. And I think that that's how she develops this really meaningful relationship where people really feel heard. So there is definitely something about that I'm not sure we're there yet.
Thank you so much, Alex. So that's not all from Sarah Alex. We're now going to spend the next 30-ish minutes managing some questions from participants. Just wanted a slightly self-indulgent comment. Everyone, I'm sure, will have seen that we are bothering you all with our annual state of the sector research. We'd be really keen for people to fill that out, so I'll put it in the chat for everyone. Oh, Molly's already done it. She's quicker than me. Thank you. Russell, hand over to you.
Lovely, thanks, Sam. Thanks, Sarah and Alex. It's so useful just to hear more detail. I know you spent a lot of time, on the ground for this evaluation. I think that the first question is from Jackie Lothian from Clinks, who's just asking about how the review is feeding into the current procurement process. But let me ask Jackie to ask exactly what she'd like to know.
Thanks, Russell. Yeah, it kind of overlapped with Sam's question, really. Rachel put some information in the chat about the current opportunity to express interest in operating a new problem-solving court, one of the models being for women. And I suppose it felt really important to me, what we've just heard from Rachel and Sarah, that in some way can influence the models that are commissioned. So if government does go forward with new courts for women, I think they really, really need to take on board what we've just heard. And so I suppose my question is, are there any channels through which that can happen?
I mean, we've been working closely with some people who are interested in who are putting an expression of interest in and just giving a bit of sort of advice and guidance. Our evaluation report is open access, so it's available for anybody to read. It's open on the internet. Anybody can read and have a look and use that evaluation to inform what they want to put together in terms of the expression of interest. Alex, I don't know if you have anything to add.
I think we would always be open to have any conversations with people, and we really, primarily want this research to go places and have real impact. So, and I think as well, like obviously the expression of interest is for, those specific ISC models, which may be suitable in places, but also thinking about, you know, the benefits of the Manchester model, that magistrate-led panel as well, you know, that's always an option for different sort of counties to consider as well. It's not just, doesn't just have to be the Ministry of Justice expression of interest, I guess, that framework. So we'd be very open to have conversations with people around that.
Thank you.
Lovely, thanks very much. I'm going to ask Jack Tracy now. I know Jack's keen to ask a question about women-specific assessments. Jack?
Oh, well, I'll leave that to come in later. I was just going to respond directly to Jackie and say to everyone on the call that if folks are interested in putting in applications for piloting one of the new ISEs, please reach out to Rachel Cross, who's on this call, I believe, and her team at the Centre for Justice Innovation. They're funded by the Jabs Foundation for Women and Girls to kind of lead this work nationally and help folks develop their models and implement the court should they be awarded a pilot. And they're an absolutely superb team, as everyone knows. So I just wanted to say that there are absolutely avenues for getting those applications in and for exploring models with the CJI, who I know have worked closely with Alexandra and her team through the problem-solving court networks that they've established too.
Thanks, Jack. And Rachel's put her email in the chat. But while you're talking, Jack, why don't you go on and ask about the WRNA?
Yeah, sure. Okay. So for those that don't know, the Women's Risk and Need Assessment, it's used by the Effective Women's Centre partnership organisations, of which there are 7 across the country, and research into its use has been led by the University of Birmingham, recently validated with MOJ match data that gave some truly exciting findings, and that can be that validation paper can be found online now. But I wanted to ask, it's been such a key feature actually of the Birmingham ISC. And they use the assessment as part of the pre-sentence report process with information shared across the partnership as well as with the judge. And so it's been good, for example, for women in touch with the Birmingham ISC not having to retell their story, everyone kind of singing from the same hymn sheet and not using multiple assessments. So I was just curious, within your research, was there any findings around the importance of really proper gendered assessments conducted, perhaps as is done in Birmingham, as a partnership between probation and women's centres within women's centres to understand the needs of women in touch with the process? Because, for example, I know traditional probation assessments just simply aren't constructed with women in mind in particular.
Yes, kind of. So the probation staff were co-located in the Manchester model. So they were women's specialist probation officers, were very well experienced and knowledgeable, and had great working relationships with the women. They were co-located in the women's centres, so there was all that sort of signposting and collaboration going on. So whenever the women talked about potential issues with the process as a whole, it wasn't about the identification of any needs or support they were getting. That was all in place for the women. The women actually said, which won't come as a surprise to anybody that works in this area, if I hadn't have had all this support, if I'd have had all this support before, I wouldn't have offended. So the support wasn't the issue, or, what needs were put in place. Like, women had such good relationships with the probation staff. They were having the natural conversations anyway. That information was being picked up in our evidence as far as we could see. The issues were with the court space mainly. I don't know if you have anything to add, Alex.
I think that might be a no. Well, I want to wait for a couple more questions. Can I ask you another question about the kind of partnership working between the women's centres and the probation service in particular? Because I've been evaluating a women's diversion program recently, and I was really impressed by the women's centre kind of resisting that temptation to say to the women, "Oh yes, probation's a load of," etc., etc. And actually, they work really kind of positively, kind of accepting that in this case they were working with women at breach, so they needed to comply with the conditions of the order while kind of getting the support from the women's centre, and they were able to really help women navigate that process without kind of just throwing probation under a bus. And I was quite impressed by that. So be interesting to see how much that came up as an issue for different people.
Yeah, again, it didn't come up as an issue. In the work that we did, and we sat across in quite a few different women's centres, that relational practice with probation officers and with the women's centre worker was a real strength from the women, and that's what they used to talk about all the time. And probation officers, you know, again, this wasn't something that was collected as part of the evidence, but when we were hanging around, I suppose we'd call it ethnography, but hanging around in the women's centres, they're big open offices. They're sat sort of located together, working together, and that we saw in the women's experiences really strengthened. I suppose when we're thinking about gender responsivity, what we're moving away from is this positive idea of risk and need, and we're thinking about relationships, and we're thinking about trust, and we're thinking about how women feel. So it's moving more towards that aspect of practice than things like risk assessments. Alex, I don't know if you've anything to add.
Not really. I mean, I think from like a trauma-informed model, you obviously want to reduce the amount of times you're asking someone something really deeply sensitive. But again, thinking about when does that take place, at what point in the relationship, like how's, you know, women's sort of connection with that worker developed and enhanced in order to be asking those things. And so you definitely want to keep it to a minimum, but I think it's hard for us to kind of to speak about risk assessments, because that wasn't necessarily something that we sort of divulged in. But I think the co-location is really the strength for those relationships between probation staff and the women's centre staff. That definitely was a huge positive.
Thanks very much. I'm going to ask Sandra Beaton now. Sandra's raised an important issue. Would you like to ask your question, Sandra?
Yes, please. Yeah, Black and ethnic minority women's needs doesn't seem to feature in any of the story so far.
We had that conversation as well as part of the research. We spent 57 hours in court between us, maybe more really, but we didn't see anybody from a Black or ethnic minority background walk through the door. And I think that's a conversation that we all need to have in terms of that reach and connection with women from marginalized communities. Definitely.
Yeah. It's something that we wrote about it in the report as well, because we know that previous evaluations was an evaluation of the whole system approach done in Manchester in 2018, and that talks about invisibility as well.
Yeah, sorry, talks about it, but nothing seems to be done. I mean, I remember in the WRNA initial report, which was supposedly a whole systems approach, not a dicky bird in that. Is it just you can't find black women? Is that what the problem is?
So we didn't see any Black women come through the problem-solving court model when we observed, no, and we asked for data, and the data wasn't collected either. So there was nothing else that we could do in terms of analysing that, because it wasn't available for us.
Sorry,
which I think is a telling sign in itself.
If you looked at Manchester, I believe the WRNA was in Birmingham. Perhaps if somebody looks in London, maybe they can find Black women there.
I think it's clear, Sandra, sorry for butting in, but clearly there are lots of Black women that are in need of this service and not just being, sent to prison. I think perhaps, one of the really worrying things is data not being collected. And Joy Dell kind of quite reasonably, I think, raises the concern that perhaps you didn't see Black women there because they're being sent to custody and not getting the opportunity of solution-focused problem-solving courts. And that's obviously become circular. If people aren't recording it, then people aren't able to shout up and down, because obviously we're talking about these courts being based in extremely diverse cities. So it's not like the pilot was in the middle of the rural countryside with lower numbers of Black women there.
Yeah, and I think that's really important for us to be thinking about, the data that is collected. I know from a completely separate research project around Muslim women involved in the justice system, finding specific statistics on ethnicity or faith within probation, for example, is pretty tricky sometimes. And I guess that was mine and Sarah's concern, is if we're not seeing, any Black or ethnic minority women walk through the store, where are they walking into? But obviously it's difficult for us to comment because we don't have the statistics to kind of to tell that journey. But it is definitely a concern. And I think as well, there's some really helpful data actually from the Centre for Justice Innovation around custody rates and incarceration rates for women serving short sentences in different sort of jurisdictions, counties. But again, that story doesn't necessarily tell us about additional kind of groups or cultural experiences within that as well. So it's hard.
Thank you.
Thanks. But I'm sure we certainly need to kind of come back to this issue. So because clearly it's a big one.
Sorry, Russell.
Sandra.
Just to say, I'm the only one who seems to be raising it. I've been to a number of these Clinks events now, and nothing, absolutely nothing. And I seem to be the only one. So I don't know what to say really.
Well, Sandra, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move on to another question in a minute, but before then, I'm going to let Jackie Lothian from the Clinks Women's Network kind of just respond to see, if that issue is on the agenda and what Clinks is helping to do about that.
Thanks, Russell, and thanks, Sandra, for raising it. I agree, it's a hugely important issue. I suppose what I wanted to say is it is something that has been raised, is continuously raised with us. And through our race and justice work, we do try and address it. We work quite closely with Hibiscus and other organisations in the network. And we're aware that lack of data is a really significant issue. It makes it very difficult to understand what is actually happening. We work with organisations like SheWise and the Muslim Women in Prison Project. But I get your frustration, because I know Hibiscus and others are deeply frustrated that as yet we don't seem to be making any progress. So we can talk about it, we can raise issues, but I agree there is a lack of progress. It's not for want of trying, and I would disagree with your point that we never raise it. Certainly we've had several events that focus specifically on women and race, not recently, I have to say. Last year we had some, and there will be more happening. But I think the general concern is about lack of action and lack of progress. But thanks, Russell, for letting me come back in.
Thanks, Jackie. I mean, I think it's fairly, we have data around ethnicity, certainly the prison service, for obviously decades here. So I'm not clear why there's a lack of data, especially since post-LAMI, which the MOJ is required to report on progress on every year. I'm going to move on to another issue in a moment, but I did see that even though we're mainly taking questions through the chat, that Ingrid raised her hand. So Ingrid, if it's on this issue, why don't you kind of chip in now as well?
I guess, I'm sorry, I just find it quicker. I guess my concern is how we present a very positive report and a very positive insight into this review and into what's happening in the problem-solving course, when we quite clearly are not including, it's not inclusive if Black women are not being seen. I struggle with it being presented so positively when Black women are not being seen, especially when we know that for Black women, that they're more likely to receive sentences and more likely to do so at an earlier stage on all of this, and we know all this. The data that we have got, which you said quite clearly, is that in 57 hours of being in the court spaces, you didn't see one Black woman come through the door. That's clear data, actually. And if that's the only data that you have, then that's the data that we can speak to powerfully. And I'm not sure we're speaking to that data as powerfully as we can. It sounds kind of slightly dismissive. I don't think you intend to do that, but that's how it comes across. I find that all really concerning.
Thank you, Ingrid. I think I'm just going to let us sit with that for a minute, because I don't think there's an easy answer or an acceptable answer, especially as the MOJ is kind of rolling these out, and everyone I think is well aware of racial disparity throughout the criminal justice system. So I'm not going to put Rachel on the spot, but I'm making an assumption that within that MOJ procurement there'll be some requirement to A, measure ethnicity, and B, to make services accessible to Black women. Moving on without kind of ignoring that, but Christina Kennedy raises an interesting point about a possible downside to co-location. Christina, did you want to ask Alex and Sarah about that?
Yeah, so I've recently started with the Greater Manchester Women's Support Alliance, and obviously we've got the 9 centres across the whole of Greater Manchester who are working on the HMPPS contract and do co-location stuff. I would say the co-location is good. I wouldn't say that it is a negative thing, but one of the things that we have seen come through recent research from Greater Manchester Combined Authority was they were doing research on women who are continuously coming back through the system, and they did some interviews with women who did access women's centres and some who didn't via that probation kind of route and referral. And one of the things that kind of really stuck with me, I only got sent it last week, and one of the things that really stuck with me was some of the women who didn't or chose not to engage with the women's centres had said that the reason being was that co-location had made it feel like the women's centre was part of the system. There wasn't an issue with the support that women did receive if they had engaged. It was more for that getting them through the door in the first place, and really considering whether there's a potential for the women's centres to not feel like an independent space for some women. And so, yeah, I was just wondering if any of that came through some of your research, because I just find it quite an interesting one that would come through the GMCA research.
It definitely did, especially when we were because spent quite a lot of time in women's centres, and we were just speaking kind of locally with staff. We were saying, like, do you think the reviews could take place here? And there was a lot of resistance to that, understandably, not wanting to be associated with justice taking place. So there was definitely that felt sense of women's centres becoming more and more involved and entrenched within criminal justice practices, definitely.
I suppose one of the underpinning problems for that comes back to funding, doesn't it? And some of the women's centres funding streams come through criminal justice avenues, but we definitely found that as well. And I think it's one of the, just bringing in this idea. I think Alex and I as academics are quite privileged that we can speak independently and openly on the research findings that we've on the women's experiences that we included in our research on the problem solving court model, because I do think it has potential, but it's about sort of reflection and pausing and not just going full steam ahead with something that according to a lot of practitioners, is like a gold standard thing. I think we still need to be questioning and reflecting consistently on how we're doing things, what data we're collecting, who is experiencing this model as positive, who isn't experiencing this model at all. I think all those problems all those sort of issues we need to think about in terms of like just pausing and taking things slowly and not being afraid to reflect, I suppose.
Thanks, Sarah. And I'm sure people have got the chat open, but if they haven't, just to say that Joy Dole from Anna Wynne in the West Midlands is asking for data on the ethnicity of women going through the Birmingham ISC. And clearly, I think there's possibly a role for Clinks going forward if we can collate data from different areas. Because I think, as has already been said, if we find the data's not there, that's a really important finding. And with the MOJ rolling out some more of these courts, it's really not a situation that can persist like that. Really interesting to hear Sarah and Alex talk about. Yeah, we haven't necessarily looked at all the models of what the best model is likely to be. And obviously, once something gets in a specification with funding, it kind of that becomes the kind of model. So, can I just ask you and Alex to say a little bit more, and whether you're aware of other types of model, or you think there are international models apart from kind of cloning charismatic Argentinian judges?
I think that one of the things we do generally, like we have a risk-focused system, don't we? So we can take these gold standard models, international models like problem solving and like restorative justice, and when we shoehorn them into risk principles, that's where we begin to see the problems, and it just boils down to the same old difficulties with the justice system. But I think that rather than, I would say the Argentinian model, but it's more the theme or the underpinning principle of that model, which is about a restorative approach. So Jimena talks, as Alex mentioned, about the state being the one that's held accountable. So I suppose it's thinking about how that can be built into our models. How can the judge be an advocate when women are saying, I'm struggling to get my landlord to sort out the broken window and the mold, or I'm struggling, I just want to go to detox, can't somebody just fast track me? All those areas where the state is failing, how can we put some accountability back on the state? How can the judiciary, how can the model put that responsibility back on the state rather than the women who are dealing with multiple things. So I think it's about taking elements of best practice from different models would be my opinion. Alex?
We were really lucky that Jimena was actually touring problem solving courts when we had our event in Manchester in June for the launch. And there was a really poignant moment. I love listening to the way that Jimena kind of talks about the connection between care, love, and justice in the judiciary. And as a judge herself, she says there's no law that prevents us from being compassionate, you know, and actually having her speak within, you know, because we're academics, so sometimes we're seen as like pie in the sky, and you know, like we come up with these ideas and we're far away from practice. So there is that sometimes, you know, important critical reflection. But you know, there was a point where someone asked Jimena if she allows people in her court to call her by her first name. And she burst out laughing. She couldn't believe that someone was asking that. She was like, of course they do. What else will they call me? You know, and there was this, it was really quite a poignant moment in that difference within our approaches. So thinking about what Sarah just said about our risk approach. And that was it was humorous, and it was very well kind of held and supported, but it was a real cultural shift that we were seeing towards this relational model of humanness, really.
Thanks, Alex and Sarah. Rachel, you put in another really helpful kind of comment in the chat, but I feel like I shouldn't be talking for you. So would you say this share that information you were the technical bit that I'm probably going to get wrong if I do it, Rachel Cross?
Can you hear me, everybody? Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Brilliant. So basically, there's been some information, some research that's been going on at the Centre for Justice at the moment about the problem-solving courts that are outside of the ISC framework. And when the problem-solving courts went live, statutory instruments included Manchester to have the powers to review community orders. Without those extra powers, you can only review in the magistrates' court suspended sentence orders. And I think with the ISC expression of interest going on at the moment, I think the process takes about 3 months to apply for. But with the expression of interest for the ISC going on at the moment, I'm not too sure whether the government would actually extend that to other areas because of the concentration at the moment for the intensive supervision courts. But that legislation is already included in the intensive supervision courts. So if you're setting up a problem-solving court outside of the areas that have already been granted permission through that statutory instrument, you've only got the powers to review suspended sentences, not community orders. So it's just making sure that people have got the right information before they start setting up problem-solving courts.
Thanks very much, Rachel. I'm glad you said that. I'd have got that wrong.
But if anybody wants any more information about that, I'll put my email in the chat. So we're more than happy to help people at the Centre set up problem-solving courts outside of the intensive supervision court framework. But it's just making sure that people have got the specific powers to do that legally.
And I think as we've seen today, it's really helpful for people to come together and talk through different issues, and especially if there's some experience and expertise that we've got from Sarah and Alex, but obviously also from the Centre for Justice Innovation that I know has been working in this area for quite a while. Thanks ever so much, everyone, for getting involved. I think it's clearly really important that we hang on to that racial disparity issue and not just forget about it after this conversation. But thanks very much for everyone sharing so much information. I know there's been a lot of kind of chat between people on, but I'm going to hand back now to Sam to thank everyone properly.
Thank you so much. I shouldn't say this because we've had a range of brilliant presenters, but that was my favourite session so far. The timing wasn't, I don't think it was deliberate, Russell, the fact that we held this at the same time as the EOI process for ISCs. Of course it was. But I mean, it was perfect timing, and it's really great to be talking about academic research that marries immediately with things that are happening in real time. It really shows you the importance of that research. So I just wanted to really thank Alex and Sarah, for a brilliant review and for all of your work, and for taking the time to present today, but also people for coming today, bringing their questions and their thoughts and having a really interesting debate. We do about 4 of these a year. We've got another one which will soon be advertised in December on GRT communities, but we will you will see across our channels as soon as that's ready to go live. So I think, unless you have anything else to add, Russell, I can call this meeting to order 2.5 minutes early. Thank you everyone so much. I hope you have a lovely, I forgot what day it is.
Thank you for having us.